Hi folks, Lawrence Patias here with the second mini lecture. It was in the 1980s that things started to get really interesting, or tragic, whichever way you want to look at it. It was during the 1980s that the idea of repressed memories seemed to come back into fashion, and the idea was spread through books and through talk shows and through the media. It was combined with a newfound concern about child sexual abuse and incest. People were becoming more aware of this problem. It led to a large number of psychotherapists to try and dig for lost memories of abuse in their patients. That trend grew over the 1980s and even included the recall of satanic ritual abuse in some psychotherapies. It was not really until the 1990s that memory psychologists started to question whether the memories were real. Memory researchers like Elizabeth Loftus started to notice a problem and speak out about the possible inaccuracies in these recovered memories of abuse, especially the more bizarre stories. And in general, these skeptics had an important effect on the trend. Some of that skepticism finally made it into the mainstream media, onto TV shows, documentaries, and it seemed like the craze of the satanic ritual abuse panic of the 1980s was at least being improved by the skepticism in the 1990s. Now, the narrative of what happened after that depends on who you ask. If you ask me, and I look at my research quite recently, I would say that the problem of repressed memory recovery still seems to occur today too, and we'll talk about that research at the end of this mini lecture. In this mini lecture, I'm going to present to you some of the seminal case studies that are important to understand and to have that knowledge so that you understand what the problem was and is, so that when we get to the research on false memories and other areas of memory later, you will understand why that research is important. Here are some of the case studies that help explain the history of this problem of determining whether memory is accurate in a court of law since the 1980s. I hope you enjoy it. So the first case study is one of ritualistic satanic abuse, and I wrote just a tiny bit about this in Patias and Young's 2015, in which I give some of the details of the quotes in a bit more detail. So the book Michelle Remembers is published in 1980, and it involves a famous case of repressed memory recall that may have influenced later trends in repressed memory recovery, especially in the realm of satanic abuse recovery. So in this book, Michelle Remembers, it chronicles a patient who, in 1973, this patient, Michelle, started therapy with Canadian psychiatrist Lawrence Pasda, and through hypnosis and other techniques, subsequently recovered severe satanic ritual abuse memories, and that recovery began in 1976 when Michelle was an adult. Now, Michelle recovered memories from a 2-year period in her childhood from between ages 5 and 7, in which she remembered being in a satanic cult with her mother. She had no memory of this before therapy. Her revelations included a series of sacrifices and cannibalistic rituals. She witnessed the murder of a baby, a ritualistic surgery on herself. She witnessed several dead bodies and the dismemberment of bodies, and remembered being kept captive in a cage as well, all of which there is no evidence ever found for. So there's not even any evidence that there was a cult or that she was in a cult. So as unlikely as these events are, and they raise questions, don't they, about whether repressed memories could lead to false memories, at least those we just discussed were at least physically possible. Nevertheless, Michelle goes on to describe memories of supernatural things that could not have happened, which gives even more evidence for the possibility that false memories could have been produced here. For example, she describes how Satan was summoned and eventually removed Michelle's scars, thus erasing any evidence of the alleged abuse, and that her memories were erased of the events by Satan until the time was right. Michelle also describes a memory where Satan took her on a visit to hell and introduced his armies of the living dead, where she says that there's people in a terrible state. And she also remembered a sacrifice of a girl by Satan himself. Now, given the supernatural, impossible aspects of some of these memories, they're likely false memories brought about by the hypnotic sessions. Even without supernatural aspects, several investigations found no corroboration of the events portrayed in the book. One possible alternative explanation is that the authors deliberately fabricated the stories, but I don't think that is actually true, because in interviews afterwards, they carried on believing in their stories. They carried on for decades afterwards without retraction. Now, this book influenced other satanic ritual abuse scares in the 1980s and 1990s, such as the MCMARTIN preschool case, the Faith Chapel Church case, and so on. And by extension, contributed to the memory wars that came in the 1990s as well, which was a debate between those who did not believe in repressed memories and those who did. A number of authors have also noted that there is very little substantial evidence for most, or if not all, cases of satanic ritual abuse in general. For example, Lannin in 1989, in a report for the FBI, concluded that there was a general lack of physical evidence for all allegations of ritualistic satanic cult activity. Now let's move on to another vivid case study, the MCMARTIN preschool case. But before we get into the details, let's link this to the last page that we talked about. In 1984, Lawrence Pasder, if you remember, he was one of the authors of Michelle Remembers from the last page. He acted as a consultant on this MCMARTIN preschool trial case. Pasder also appeared on the first major news report on satanic ritual abuse, which was broadcast in 1985, and continued to give his point of view to the media for the next decade or so afterwards. So perhaps the Michelle Remembers book had an effect. Now, the MCMARTIN preschool trial was a daycare sexual abuse case in the 1980s, prosecuted by the Los Angeles district attorneys. Members of the MCMARTIN family had operated a preschool in Manhattan Beach in California, and they were charged with numerous acts of sexual abuse of children in their care. Accusations were made in 1983, and arrests and the pre-trial investigations ran from 1984 to 1987, and then the trial ran from 1987 to 1990. After 6 years of criminal trials, no convictions were obtained and all charges were dropped in 1990. When the trial ended in 1990, it had been the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history. The case was part of the daycare sexual abuse hysteria of the 1980s and the moral panic over satanic ritual abuse in the 80s and 1990s. Several hundred children were interviewed by the Children's Institute International, which was a Los Angeles-based abuse therapy clinic. The interviewing techniques used during investigations of these allegations were highly suggestive and invited children to pretend or speculate or to imagine about supposed events. By the spring of 1984, it was claimed from these interviews and this therapy that 360 children had been abused by this small daycare center. Some of the abuse that was alleged was bizarre. For example, some suggestions were that there were secret tunnels beneath the school, and several children started to remember this. And then after several excavations, they turned up absolutely no evidence of any underground tunnels or secret chambers. There were claims of children being flushed down toilets into secret rooms where they would be abused and then they would be cleaned up and then presented back to their parents. Again, there was no evidence of these rooms or these connections, or any of this was ever found. In fact, there were some bizarre allegations, like, for example, the person who made the initial allegations that started off the whole tornado of copycat allegations made bizarre and impossible statements about Raymond Buckley, who was one of the accused, including that he could fly. In 2005, after many years, one of the children who was an original accuser retracted their allegations of abuse by saying this, in quote, "Never did anyone do anything to me, and I never saw them do anything. I said a lot of things that didn't happen. I lied. Anytime I would give them an answer that they didn't like, they would ask me again and encourage me to give them the answer they were looking for. I felt uncomfortable and a little ashamed that I was being dishonest. But at the same time, being the type of person I was, whatever my parents wanted me to do, I would do. Perhaps some of the children were developing false memories. Maybe the adult who gave the initial accusation was suffering from false memories. And maybe some of them were developing not false memories, but deliberately lying just to give what the adults were asking for. Now on to another famous seminal case of repressed memories in therapy and resulting legal case. Let's talk about the Franklin case. In 1969, an 8-year-old girl, Susan Nason, disappeared from California. Her body was found 3 months later a few miles from her home in Foster City, California. 20 years later, in 1989, Eileen Franklin, the daughter of George Franklin, reported that she had recovered repressed memories indicating that her father had murdered and raped the girl. Eileen provided numerous details that matched details of the crime scene, and on the basis of her memory, George Franklin was arrested and charged with murder. Now, Eileen claims to have observed her father raising a big rock and killing the girl, so she claims that she was present, but also claims that she was not even aware of her memories before the repressed memories came back. Now, Eileen testified at George Franklin's trial about her recovered memory. Much of the trial focused on the reliability of repressed memories, with each side presenting experts, with Elizabeth Loftus as a skeptic of repressed memories on one side and Leonore Ter as a proponent of the idea that repressed memories can be accurate. The trial judge prevented the defense from introducing newspaper accounts that mentioned the facts that Eileen Franklin revealed in court. However, he did allow the omission of some circumstantial evidence, such as Eileen Franklin saying that when she visited her father in prison, he did not say anything about the crime, and then this was taken to be evidence that he must be guilty of the crime if he did not say anything to the accusations. Franklin's silence, said the prosecutor, in the face of the accusation was, and I quote, worth its weight in gold, and was an implied admission of guilt. In November 1990, the jury found Franklin guilty of Susan's murder, although the prosecution had not produced any physical evidence to connect him to the murder. The conviction rested totally on the repressed memory testimony of Eileen Franklin. In January 1991, the judge sentenced Franklin to life imprisonment, the maximum sentence allowed. Later, a district court judge overturned the conviction in 1995, 4 years later, based on several trial errors, including the argument that a refusal to speak is an admission of guilt, and the trial judge's refusal to allow defense to argue that the details that Eileen provided about the case were based on newspaper articles, so she got the details from those, they argued. While the case was awaiting retrial, Eileen Franklin's sister came forward, Janice Franklin came forward, and revealed that Eileen Franklin's repressed memories were indeed recalled through hypnosis. Both of them had testified earlier at trial that Eileen had not been hypnotized. Because the state Supreme Court had ruled that the testimony based on memories recovered by hypnosis is unreliable, the evidence was thrown out, and Eileen could have been barred from taking the stand in a new trial. Furthermore, it gets curiouser and curiouser. Eileen Franklin's credibility was called into question even more because she later contended that she had also recalled repressed memories of 2 other murders committed by her father. The murders of 18-year-old Veronica Casisco and 17-year-old Paula Baxter. However, DNA tests conducted on the rape kits in 1995 revealed a male DNA profile that was not Franklin. So even in those early DNA analyses, Franklin was ruled out of those accusations. In July 1996, prosecutors announced that they would not retry Franklin, and he was released in 1996 after serving 5 years behind bars. Franklin later filed a federal lawsuit seeking compensation, but the lawsuit was dismissed. And then just recently, in 2018, the DNA evidence that linked Rodney Lynn Halbauer to the murders, and Halbauer was convicted of both murders and sentenced to life in prison. For the Ramona case, let's have an interview given by Elizabeth Loftus on a case that took place in the mid-1990s.
One of the saddest cases that I have come across in my years of working on these repressed memory cases is the case of the Ramona family. Gary Ramona was an executive with the Mondavi winery. He was making $300,000 or $400,000 a year as a high-level executive. He lived in a beautiful house. He had a beautiful family, lived in a wonderful part of the world in Napa, California. And his whole world came crashing down when his daughter, Holly Ramona, went into therapy as a sophomore in college, and there she remembered, with the help of her therapist, that he'd raped her for more than a decade, that he'd forced her into, all kinds of sexual acts, including sex with the family dog, that she'd repressed this, she claimed, until the psychotherapy helped make the presence of these memories known to her. The whole family was destroyed. Gary Ramona lost his job, he lost his family, his life fell apart. And what happened in terms of the legal system is the daughter sued her father. Well, thousands of those cases were going on. But in an unusual move, Gary Ramona, the father, sued the therapist for planting false memories in the mind of his daughter. And he won a $500,000 verdict from a jury in Napa, California. And this whole story of the Ramona saga was told in a fabulous book by Moira Johnston called Spectral Evidence. Well, today, Gary still has lost his family. He's long since divorced. He still has lost his job. He did spend a little bit of time getting involved in the wine business, importing wines from Chile. He doesn't have his family back. And his daughter, Holly Ramona, now that is another story, because right about the time I was taking a new job at the University of California in Irvine, I got contacted by a woman who told me that, like many of the women who contact me, that she was so upset. Her daughter was estranged from the family. She was developing all these memories of abuse that the mother was positive never happened. And when I said to this mother, this sad new mother, I said, why don't you try to find out who is your daughter's therapist? Maybe we can find out it's one of the therapists who tends to be implicated in these cases. She went away and she came back and she said, I found out my daughter's therapist's name. It's Holly Ramona.
Isn't that an amazing case? Now on to the next case, the Carol FELSTEAD case. This is a BBC clip that I'll just play for you.
Campaigners are calling for better regulation of the psychotherapy industry and a warning that some therapists are implanting false memories into the minds of vulnerable people. The family of one London nurse is raising awareness of the issue after she falsely accused them of murder. Sarah Harris reports.
She was a beautiful, happy child who grew up to achieve her dream of becoming a London nurse. But Carol's family say after she had therapy under hypnosis to help with headaches in her 20s, she falsely accused them of satanic abuse and murder before she sadly passed away. The allegations broke her father's heart.
Carol's early life had been wiped out completely, and she didn't remember it, and it had been replaced by these horrific memories which are totally false, every single one of them. And it grieves me to think that Carol wouldn't know how much we loved her, at the end.
Carol's relatives are now leading a campaign to help dozens of other families who believe they've been falsely accused after their loved ones have undergone the same therapy.
There are far too many victims of sexual abuse, and they need to be supported. But when you're directing your resources at these fantasy cases, you're not supporting them, you're doing the opposite. And the difference between real victims is that they have been traumatised, but sadly for them, they can remember that trauma. They don't need a therapist to unblock their memories. They need to put them in a metaphorical drawer and deal with them on a day-to-day basis.
Dr. Julia Shaw is a memory expert at University College London. She's looked into many cases of false memory and says although the UK Council of Psychotherapists has already discredited this technique, more needs to be done.
There is need for more regulation. There's need for people to know and understand the risks associated with going into people's pasts and asking leading questions and trying to tease out memories of assumed events. So I think there's a definite need for more regulation in this field.
Dozens of families have already contacted the FELSTEADs from in and around London saying their loved one has fallen victim to the same sessions where so-called memories are recovered by hypnosis. In Carol's name, they say they won't rest until there is proper regulation, a chance to stop another family being painfully torn apart over flashbacks that never really happened at all. Sarah Harris, BBC London News.
Now, there's been some influential books since Freud that have reified the idea of repressed memories in a different way. They often criticize Freud and then they present a similar theory. A Courage to Heal was very influential. It was a book that was read by many millions of people and led to a lot of false accusations that came out of false memories from people trying to use vague symptoms that they felt to then extrapolate to try and search for memories, and they ended up creating false memories of abuse. Another book by Judith Herman was also influential in this way, same kind of theory of repressed memories. Betrayal Trauma by Jennifer Freud changed the theory slightly, but there's a very similar kind of underlying idea that you can have this trauma that might not be known to the person as they go through life. And there's been some newer books too. Now, importantly, this idea of dissociative amnesia or repressed memories has been put into the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the scientific book that clinicians look to for guidance. The idea was solidified that memories can be repressed into this very widely read and influential book. And of course, that might come up in court if you have an expert witness who is arguing that the repressed memories should be counted as evidence against a defendant, then they might talk about it being in the DSM-5. So to what extent do people still believe that repressed memories exist and are common? So in my 2014 paper, Patias et al., we found that 64% of undergraduates believe that repressed memories can be retrieved accurately in therapy. Clinical psychologists, the researchers, on the one hand, only 16% of researchers believed in it, but practitioners, 43% of practitioners in clinical psychology do have some level of belief in repressed memories. Just very briefly, we have also asked people who have had therapy, in therapy, have you ever come to remember being abused as a child when you had no previous memory of such abuse, which is very similar to the definition of repressed memories. We found that there was a peak in the 1990s, but even still today, 2015 onwards, still 9% of people who are doing therapy are reporting this kind of repressed memories or recovered memories. So it's still a relevant problem in society, and indeed court cases still are going on related to repressed memories. And Kevin FELSTEAD, who works for the British False Memory Society, whose sister was Carol FELSTEAD, who passed away, he's told me in one of the interviews I did with him on YouTube about the number of court cases happening, so it's still ongoing. Thanks folks for listening. The main takeaway from this second lecture is that during the 1980s there was a large increase in the number of therapists doing repressed memory work, that there was a memory war in the 1990s between skeptics and non-skeptics of repressed memory recovery. It affected quite a lot of court cases, and you learned about some of those cases today. And in recent research, we've found that the memory wars may not be over. There may be still quite a good number of individuals recalling repressed memories in therapy, and indeed there are court cases still coming up in the UK on this topic.